Now pay attention, 007. I've always tried to teach you two things. First, never let them see you bleeding.
And the second?
Always have an escape.
Hey, well, welcome back, everyone, to Those Bond Guys podcast. This is David Vanderbout here, and I'm here with my partner in crime, Chris Morales. How you doing, Chris?
Good. You know, it's kind of crazy. Today was the first day that we had a really big downpour, and it's finally feeling like fall. So everybody's busting out all the pea coats, the safari jackets, and everything. I know yours are still packed away, but I'm sure they'll be making an appearance real soon, right?
Well, and peacoat in California, right, is like if it's like 75 degrees, people are like, "Oh, let's wear a peacoat now."
Oh, yeah, we don't have too many excuses nowadays, but
Awesome. I know both of us have been moving, so we've been busy with that, but we're back here today, and in our next How to Bond series, and today we really have kind of, I guess you could call the originator of the How to Bond, or at least definitely kind of an inspiration for us and many others. The author of Being James Bond and the creator of the Being James Bond podcast, Joe Darlington. Thanks for being here today, Joe.
How's it going, gentlemen? You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Wonderful. And I know, Chris, you just got back from Gather All. And,
yes, where finally Joe and I got to meet in person and kind of talk about what we've been doing. And it's crazy to think. I was looking on my YouTube, Joe, and I remember you were the first interview that I did on my That One Bond Guys Meet series, and that was 3 years ago. Believe it or not.
Wow.
I know.
Doesn't honestly, seriously, doesn't the last couple of years just feel like they don't really count? Like we just sort of skipped, you know?
Right.
Yeah, hard to believe it was that long ago, but yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Oh my goodness, yes, long overdue, and oh my gosh, It was so much fun hanging out with everybody, meeting a lot of people finally that I know we've engaged, whether it was via Zoom or Instagram or whatnot. But it was amazing, and being able to share how your book kind of inspired me was pretty cool in person to do that. So, but speaking of that, David, I think we're gonna have a really exciting topic today.
Again, yeah. I mean, when we talked to Joe and they had him invited him to come on, he's been so gracious to come on for us. Today we're going to take it obviously back a little bit farther. Joe obviously has his wonderful Being James Bond podcast and lots of great content there. But we're going to take it a little bit farther back to his book, Being James Bond, and go through some kind of topics that, as I said, were the influence really for one of the influences for starting this How to Bond podcast, or kind of this series that we're doing. So I think the first question, let's start kind of at the beginning, Joe, going back to when you started writing this book, thinking about writing this book. What was kind of your inspiration to write a book about being James Bond? Obviously, there's lots of different ways you could go in terms of the authorship route. What inspired you to write a book about being James Bond?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for the question, because again, it's a topic that I very much enjoy revisiting. I sort of feel like, in a way, I'm gonna cheat a little bit and take a line from I'm sure you guys have seen Fight Club. One of my favorite lines from the film is it was on the tip of everyone's tongue, we just gave it a name. And I sort of feel like that's exactly what being James Bond was. It was sort of, whether we were conscious of it or not, myself and guys like you guys and a lot of other of us were sort of doing that thing where we were kind of looking at James Bond as, kind of a role model of a sort, even though, it's interesting that Bond is a fictional character. So in a way, we're sort of already conscious of the fact that to try to live like James Bond is definitely shooting for the bleachers. We're really striving for something that may or may not be even realistic, right? Because this is not a real person. But in the back of our minds, again, we're trying to sort of up our clothing a little bit, up our travel, and try to do a little bit more of the things that we see James Bond doing. And it kind of just sort of boiled down to the question that again, is it realistic for a person to be able to really strive and really try to do all those things that James Bond can do? Because I mean, the guy, it's almost like that's sort of his superpower, is that just no matter what you put in front of him, he can do it, and he can do it. He can always beat the baddie at his own game, no matter what that game might be. And it's just an incredible way to live. So it kind of became this sort of challenge in a way where I would sort of look at all of these things that Bond was doing and say, what are all these things? Like, if I really set out to try to do every single thing that I've seen James Bond do, how realistic is that? Is that a thing that a human being could actually do? And I started to gather up, all of the things I've seen him do. I mean, I've seen James Bond fly planes. I've seen him play poker. I've seen him display expert knowledge of so many different topics. So I just kind of just try to put them all together in a big old list and see, like, is this a possible thing? And yeah, I kind of felt that once I sort of looked at it all, you know, again, I can't imagine, like, you watch a James Bond movie where he's confronted with an agent who speaks another language. Probably in the world of fiction, you're not going to catch him off guard with a language he doesn't know. So does that mean we know every single language in the world? Probably not, but there's probably a lot that we could learn if we wanted to. So yeah, the bottom line is I just kind of looked at this and looked at it as sort of a challenge and said, well, how much could I really learn and really sort of get the hang of, and again, at least get sort of a beginner's knowledge of, so that, like, for example, if I did get invited to a game of golf or a game of poker or a game of, I want to at least know the basics so I don't look real silly. You know what I mean? Even if I'm not an expert at it. So that was kind of it, and it just sort of became just one giant bucket list, just trying to do a lot of these things and try to up my game a little bit. And I tell you, I mean, and the ride has been absolutely incredible.
That's awesome. I mean, I remember, just going through all the different topics, and oh my gosh, there's tons of topics, not just within the book that you made, but in Bond in general. And it reminds me of, especially when you're talking about how Bond has to be knowledgeable on certain topics, whether it's learning a language or playing a certain game. And I forget exactly what it was, but you guys may have a better memory than I do. But Roger Moore did like a special where he was Roger Moore, but he like was talking about Bond and talking about I forget exactly what the special was, but I'm sure people in the comments or whatever let me know. But there was one scene where he was walking in the library and he said, there's one thing about James Bond that maybe not a lot of people see, or there's one thing about the spy and what he has to do, and that's to be able to study and to learn and to adapt about the knowledge. And so that kind of just reminded me, reading the whole book initially, that's kind of what I got flashbacks to, is because all these different topics, you need to spend some time studying, right? Or some time to really retain the knowledge. And that's a lot that we don't see on screen. So it's kind of cool to see the process of one person and how they would pick a topic and go forth with that.
The idea of so many of these things are kind of like, here's what a man is, right? And I think for a lot of guys, whether, certain Bond movies scripted really well, some maybe aren't as well, some whatever it might be, they all have some element of that, like these elements that what as a guy we are in some way, good or bad maybe. And to be able to quantify these in as a start in your book is a really interesting way to do it.
Was it really hard to
Go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just thinking about the topics. I was going to ask you, was it really hard to kind of narrow down the ones that you really wanted to talk about, or how did you kind of just like pick the topics that you had written about, or what was that process like?
Well, two things. First of all, I want to comment on the thing that you said. I think that was I think what you're hitting on is also a big part of it, that it's almost like, to do a book about, or to discuss the things that James Bond does, in a way, it's almost like there's a subtle nuance. There's something in the background, or maybe for lack of a better way to say it, like if I was going to give it a subtitle, it would be something like along the lines of like things that fathers have told their sons for years. This is something that I feel like it is part of just the right of being a man, and I right, not RIGHT, RITE, it's just some part of the process of just being a man and living like a man, and again having certain knowledge and certain skills. Um, Chris, to your question, coming up, well, I'll tell you again. I sort of I what's how do I say this? My eyes were much bigger than my stomach when I first started down the road of doing the books. Um, I always envisioned James Bond being James Bond. Uh, when I first sort of came up with the entire concept, my first thought was, well, this seems like something you would do for a book. But incidentally, this whole thing, I came up with this right around the same time that podcasting was starting to sort of show up on the radar. And I knew one or two guys who were already doing podcasts. And I'm like, hey, what's this all about? So quickly, and once I did my first podcast for another channel, I quickly fell in love with doing it. So suddenly it was like, oh, okay, now I know what Being James Bond is going to be, and it's going to be a podcast. But it did always sort of lend itself to a book. But again, coming up with so many different topics, because again, it's James Bond, it's almost infinite the things he can do. Narrowing it down to my first volume. And again, back then, I was picturing as many as like 8 individual volumes. I'm sort of rethinking how I do it at this point. But
Wikipedia of Bond, almost.
Exactly right. It would be like we're talking a row of encyclopedias, with all the things Bond can do. But coming up with the first few chapters, so coming up with the first few topics for the first book was, I don't know if there was, I guess there were some that I thought were very logical places to start. For example, I feel like if you're going to do different travel sections, how do you not start in London if you're talking about James Bond? So that was sort of a giveaway. I think, in terms of gambling, I kind of felt that poker sort of came to the front, particularly because this was also right around the time when Casino Royale had just come out. So that was still pretty fresh in people's minds. There were poker tournaments going all over the Bond world because of it. So that was sort of very easy one. And a couple others that I just thought they seemed very natural to sort of lead the pack. And again, I was also breaking things down into, obviously gambling was sort of a subsection. Travel was a subsection. There were sort of things like different categories I wanted to touch on. And within those categories, there were certain topics that, again, sort of just floated to the top pretty naturally. So, yeah, so those were the ones that I thought made the most logical sense to do first. But again, I think going forward, as I think about doing other books in the future, there are others that I think would I'll probably just say like my close seconds and thirds, put it that way.
Right. Well, and I think what we've kind of figured out in doing this how-to series is some of the things are things that are a little bit easier for us, more, things that we all experience. And then some are a little bit more specialized, right? In terms of things that, okay, we got to find someone that could do this specific thing or whatever it might be. That's like, I have no experience with that. So as you were kind of writing the book, how much of the different topics came from just your personal experience and things that you went through versus things that you had to go research? And how did you go about the research? Did you talk to people? Were you reading other books? Like what was that research process like?
Yeah, I think most, if not all, of the first the subjects in the first book, all of them I had at least some firsthand dealings with. Again, I consider myself, what's the word? Not, master of none, but I know a little bit about a lot, kind of a thing. So all of them I had at least some firsthand knowledge of. But even having said that, just being able to say, well, yes, I've done this, doesn't mean I can speak the language. And there's a lot of specific detail that goes along with it. So all of it needed some research behind it. I probably had a stack of books. And again, I'm going back so far. Like I feel like today, Google is probably your first step for anybody researching
Just something like
anything.
that.
Yeah, I mean, whether you're an archaeologist or a doctor trying to cure a disease, I think you're probably still Googling things. Um, but this was sort of still back I wouldn't say, I think it might have been pre-Google, frankly. I guess that's probably not correct, but my research back then was still, I just bought books. I bought books, found used books, etc. So I really had to sort of do a lot of it the old-fashioned way. And again, a lot of it has more to do with, again, learning the language, learning the lingo, learning, for example, I've played poker endless times, but then again, how do I know that the people I'm playing with aren't, you know, using certain friendly rules that don't really apply, say, in a casino kind of thing? So you really do have to go, a little above and beyond and make sure that the things you're putting out there are correct, um, at least as correct as you can. For example, something that, again, Chris and I sort of share, Chris is a pilot. I've dabbled. That's something I've dabbled in, and again, boy, you're really playing with fire when you decide that you feel confident enough to write a book on how to fly a plane. I mean, again, big disclaimer: please don't try this at home unless it's an emergency.
Do you have any on how many people tried to fly planes after reading Being James Bond?
As far as I know, I think Chris is still the only one that I know of, which again probably. Go ahead.
Yeah, I will say this. I mean, it was real interesting, and I shared this at Gatherall for telling Joe that it was during the time when I first got into the book, and I was reading it right like towards the back half of high school, and like I knew I wanted to do something in aviation, right? But I just wasn't sure if piloting was the route, and I knew being a Bond fan, have been following Joe for a while and realized finally getting a hold of his book. I was reading and found the chapter on becoming a pilot, and it was like one of those things is like it's a sign. So really I read that through that chapter, and mind you, this is when I had no prior experience. I didn't know where to go look for flight schools or whatever, what like part 40, part 61, 141 manual, that. But what reading that chapter, it kind of opened up things to make it more palatable for me to really invest my time into becoming a pilot. So I told Joe, it's like, if it wasn't for that chapter, man, if it wasn't for the research in the book, I like, who knows if I ever even would have been a pilot. So that's why that chapter, that part's very special to me, is because it very much got me started with my aviation career. So
I loved that story. That was absolutely tremendous, honestly, and thank you for that, because seriously, I mean, I kind of felt like, boy, if I needed a little bit of an ego boost, that was it. I appreciate it. So thank
the
you.
funny thing was, you said you gotta really be careful with certain things when you're writing about, especially aviation, because you've done the research. The rules are the rules, and if you mess something up, somebody's going to call you out on it. But with my experience now, with my university background and getting my training done, I will say this: I've gone back and read that chapter again, and it is pretty dang close to what I actually learned through school. So I mean, I recognize the terms. A lot of it made sense. Nothing was like completely off. Like, it all made sense. So I mean, that's gotta hats off to you for that one, because
Thank
I know
you.
it's tough doing the research myself.
Yeah.
Hearing it, it's tough.
Yeah. Again, that was an interesting one for me, because again, I worked in the aviation industry for a short while, not a short while, a good while, I guess, 2 years. And so I knew, and again, I'm working in publishing, so but it's still, the topic that we were covering was aviation. But thankfully, it allowed me to meet a lot of people who were writers, not only writers about aviation, but pilots. So I had a lot of people who were willing to take me up a couple times and let me, handle the plane. And they also pointed me in the right direction. If you're ever interested in learning, here's the best. Here are the people that you want to research, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it was very lucky on my part that I had that intimate knowledge of that subject to be able to, again, dabble in it in some, again, talking about it and explaining it. I kind of feel like one of the things that I enjoy doing, and I feel that I'm probably, if I do have one strength when it comes to writing, is that um, I I I do I try to explain things in a way that I kind of always say to myself, how would I want someone to explain this to me? And break it down in a way that I think makes logical sense. And I think, the lack of genuine writing skill that I might have, I think I sort of compensate by trying to write in more of a conversational tone, where I'm trying to speak one on one to an individual. Um, so yeah. So again, that to get back to your original question, I think having some of that firsthand knowledge was part of the decision making process and saying, okay, this is a topic I'd like to jump in with first, for this first book.
Yeah. So, I mean, and you talked about the flying. So, another topic from the book, obviously, is bungee jumping. And it talks about quite a bit in the book how you actually did the Golden Eye bungee jump. I don't know how many years ago that would be now, but quite a few.
Wow. Yeah.
Could you share a little bit about that story? And also, like, for you, what is it about that experience or about bungee jumping that represents something about being James Bond for you?
Yeah, that was sort of a natural. It's funny because I write about it in the book in sort of two ways. One is just the straight up chapter on the subject of bungee jumping, and again, like I say in the book, I said, there are some topics that really lend themselves to deep detail. Then there's other topics that are like, guys, you're just gonna go show up and just jump. I mean, there's not a whole lot I can write about this. Gravity kind of does most of the work for you. Um, but I wrote about it again in the chapter, and I also wrote about it in my intro because that whole experience of doing it sort of, for me, especially back then, really did represent a few things. One is just the urge to want to go and track down and do the things that James Bond does, oftentimes in the very same places that he did it. That was one of those experiences that really, like, put it this way, I couldn't go play poker in the Casino Royale from the film because it's not a real casino. But I can go bungee jumping off that actual same dam just because they happen to have a thing for it. So again, it was just perfect. But it also gave me a way to sort of show a little bit of growth in terms of how I went about doing that. Talking about the disastrous first trip out there to try to do it and it just not happening. It's funny we're talking about this now because I was literally just talking to my wife. She was complaining. My wife does accounting for her company, and a lot of people go on business trips. And she just had something happen recently where one of the employees had rented a car and broke something and tried to not tell anybody. I'm like, I guess I can't judge because I tried that too and it didn't go so well. So yeah, so again, having had that first experience where it just didn't go, everything just went wrong, and it got kind of harrowing, honestly, because again, I'm literally just getting off the plane, not thinking this thing all the way through, renting a car, driving from one end of Switzerland to the other, which again makes about as much sense as landing in Newark Airport and thinking, hey, as long as I'm in America, I'll just go to Cape Cod for some clam chowder. Nah, not so smart. But again, I'm just kind of never having the experience before. It just looked fun on paper, so I said sure. But again, driving literally through snow-capped mountains, over the mountains when it's just freezing cold and I don't even have a jacket. I mean, this is how ridiculous this whole adventure was. But again, going back, thinking it through, planning better, and then actually making it happen. So it was sort of magical in a way. And again, it fit a lot of boxes. It checked off a lot of boxes. The Bond experience itself, the location itself, the before and after of doing it little without thinking and then kind of doing it much better. the second time. So yeah, that was kind of a natural when I sort of put that one together.
So would you say if it didn't have the Bond connection, is that something you normally would have done, or was it really the Bond piece that like drove you to it?
The actual bungee jumping
Yeah, like it's
activity.
just in, I don't know, wherever, Arizona or something.
Well,
Bungee.
I had done bungee jumping before, but really not in any sort of I mean, I remember in the late '90s, mid to late '90s, it sort of became this popular thing. So it would sort of pop up at different places, just little downtown areas would like usually would have somebody who had a crane set up, and you could do it off something that was not very big or whatever. So I had done it, 2 or 3 times before. So it was something that I always thought was kind of fun. But then again, of course, when Pierce Brosnan does it off of this gigantic dam, it's like, oh, that's a whole different animal.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, and I would even say again, as somebody who's gone skydiving a couple of times before, I think the bungee jumping is a little more harrowing because you have you, the height of, again, when you go skydiving, it's thousands of feet up, and you're usually above the cloud line. So when you actually jump, you're not really you're either seeing white of the clouds underneath you, or you're just seeing like just green. It doesn't look like anything. When you bungee jump, even as high as the Golden Eye, you see the ground. You see that concrete ground underneath you. And so the picture in your mind is a lot uglier. You really think like this is real. It
Yeah.
has more of a real feel to it. So yeah, it is a little nerve-wracking, and I kind of felt like, um, it was a moment. And I had a video of the actual jump. It wasn't a very good one because, again, this is going back a long time, and I think I haven't seen it in years, so I don't even know where it is. And it was not even a very good one either. But I do remember, when I kind of jump, like if you're watching me do it, I'm pretty, I'm smiling, I'm looking pretty confident, but it was one of those moments in life where you just sort of say to yourself, like, either this is happening or it's not. I can do it sloppy or I can just do it. You know what I mean? Um, it was funny too. When I saw there were people there who went before I did. I remember there was a girl who was there with a large group, and she was up there. She literally just started crying. Like she just stood there on the ledge. She's all buckled in, and there she's ready to go. And she's standing there, and she just like she's crying. And the guy's kind of holding her, and he was, all right, you don't have to if you don't want to. It's okay. It's perfectly safe. And he's giving a little pep talk, whatever. And she eventually did it. I remember thinking like, good for her. That was something else watching her do that. And but yeah, I've always, a lot of the things, just sort of life in general. Again, we're just a couple guys talking about life and living and doing the things that men do. We always have things that we sort of we're always scared of certain situations. Very reasonably scared to do something, and I sort of liken it to karaoke. It's gonna sound silly, but like, when people ask me, public speaking, you seem very comfortable with it, because like I'll speak at different places, etc. I always say, I said, listen, you see people all the time when you go out for karaoke night, right? There's always somebody who says, hey, let's go to karaoke, and everybody's gone to it at least once, and you see the people who go up there and they look terrified, and they're trying to look like they're not even really trying because they don't want to look silly, so they just they just do it to try to get it over with and sit down. And you know and it's weird because it's like you're not comfortable watching them because you could tell they feel uncomfortable, so the whole room is uncomfortable, really. I say, you know what, you can do that, or you could just go up and sing your face off. Just let it rip. Sing the way you sing in the car. Sing the way you sing in the shower. Because why not? Because you know what? That to me is the secret of public speaking. It's just once you realize when you're up there and you're in front of people, your instinct is that everyone is watching you, hoping you fail. But then when you take yourself out of your own body and you realize, no, that's not true. Because when you see other people up there and you see them nervous, you're rooting for them, right? So you say to yourself, they're all rooting for you too, you know? So if you just go up there, sing your face off, do it, have fun with it. You might as well. You'll have a good time. Everyone else is going to have a good time. Mm-hmm. And you know what? That way you can walk away and say, yeah, it does. Like I went up, I did it. I could have done it poorly, but I did it the best I could, and I had a good time doing it. That's kind of how we sort of tackle everything. Once you just make up your mind to do it, and have fun with it, then all of a sudden it's all right, and that's kind of, again, that's sort of how I did the bungee jump. And I said, it's terrifying. I know it's terrifying, but it's going to happen. And I can either do it sloppy or just smile and just do it, and that's exactly what I did.
I'm going to replay that last little clip there, Joe, for my choir students, because that's what I try to tell them all the time. It sounds better from Joe Darlington, so maybe that'll get an impact. But I agree. I think it seems like the idea of like overcoming fears is part of this being James Bond, how to Bond, and it's something we can take kind of all of us, right, in whatever way that might be. Before I hand it over to Chris here, so obviously this book came out, published in 2010, so there's been several Bonds, maybe not as many Bond movies as some of us would have liked since 2010, but how has your kind of the view of being James Bond, what it is like to be James Bond, has anything changed since you wrote this book? In terms of bigger picture of what it means to be James Bond. Is anything different in 2023 than it was in 2010 or 1965? I don't know.
Well, that's a great question, because, it sort of depends on which aspect or how we're sort of looking at the big picture. Lord knows there's a lot of things that have changed. I think sticking to just the films, and I think in that respect, I would say not much has really changed. I think by the time Casino Royale came out, I would be pretty hard pressed to try to think of anything that Daniel Craig has done since then that has really, like, I haven't had to think of a new chapter because Daniel Craig all of a sudden pulled something up out of nowhere that we haven't really seen before.
How to Die by Missile, maybe.
Right, exactly. How to, yeah. I think he's done things more than before. Like I'll say this. If I was going to do a motorcycle chapter, I'd be pretty hard pressed, because I felt, at the time when Casino came out, there wasn't a lot of motorcycle riding. In fact, I think the biggest one was probably Never Say Never Again. And again, do we even talk about that one, or do we not talk about that one? I'm not sure.
Which movie? What was that?
Yeah, exactly. GoldenEye, I think, probably might have been the first time I've seen an official Bond on a bike, I think. So at that point, I was like, well, technically that qualifies. So I would certainly say that Daniel Craig has normalized motorcycles for sure, because all of a sudden now I felt like I'm at least 3 of the films, I think he's on a bike.
Right.
So
I will say each Bond kind of has normalized their own little thing. Daniel Craig's with the bikes, Roger Moore with the boating, you could say. And then Pierce Brosnan always ended up in some place where he's getting choked out. I don't know, but
Yeah, exactly. So in a lot of ways, that's sort of stayed the same, and I think that's probably a tribute to the fact that that Bond has already just done so much. There's not a whole lot he hasn't really conquered yet. Although I will say, in a different respect, if you ask me what's different now from the time I did the book, well, the landscape of the Bond fandom, I think, has evolved. And in that respect, I think it's a much different world now than it was back then. I think, again, we're kind of, I'm really going to date myself a little bit, but I don't mind doing it. We're literally going back to where the internet was still pretty new back then. I can literally remember in the mid 90s, kind of the like, holy cow, what is this internet thing. I could talk to people from around the world, and this is pretty wild, that was all of a sudden really new. And then the late 90s, early 2000s, message boards and things were pretty hip, and that's sort of how you started to meet other Bond fans. And and interestingly too, we're sort of back in the days of avatars where people are just picking nicknames and funny little avatar pictures, and that's who they are. So you didn't really know people necessarily. But then again, even that evolves, and now Facebook, and now you're starting to put faces with names, and who people are, and then of course we went to Instagram, which totally went back on all that. Now it's back to I don't know who everybody is, So anyway, I'm kind of giving you a long-winded answer, but in that respect, I feel like the world definitely changed. When I think back to the first day I did a podcast, I always say it's like putting a message in a bottle and just throwing it in the ocean. You have no idea if anybody's going to hear this, so you better just enjoy doing it, because the accolades may never come. So,
well, in a way, I think also, as Bond goes on, you brought up the literary Bond, the film Bond. It seems like if any one film or book could be like, well, here's what Bond is in this book or this film, but as you compile them together, it kind of narrows a little bit of what these elements are being James Bond, right? And there's certain elements obviously that were very present maybe in Sean Connery films with maybe how he treats women or things like that. But if you look at it as kind of a compendium, right, of all these different films, all the books, you do kind of start getting a list of like, here are kind of the things that are consistent, and I think we'll talk a little bit about Bond 26 here in a few minutes, but that maybe go forward as we go forth. So,
which is interesting because as you stated, Joe, is pretty spot on to the next question I have for you. It's like, if you were to continue talking about the different topics of being James Bond in this kind of time era and stuff, how would you kind of introduce the idea of being James Bond to kind of this new younger generation, to kind of get them excited about the franchise and excited to be a part of something that obviously, like we said, Bond 26 and moving forward, how would you kind of use these topics that you've done the research on to kind of introduce the idea of that?
That's a great question, and I don't know if I know the answer to that. In terms of, I'll say this, and I don't want to be too politically incorrect here, but I guess I will. I think we're kind of living in an era where we were saying earlier that a lot of these topics would fall under the category of, things fathers tell their sons, and I think that the whole idea of what it actually means to be a man these days is kind of changing. Some would say evolving. I'll say changing, meaning some good, but some not so good, and I think that we're kind of forgetting, it's almost like we're forgetting the good parts of being a man. We're also forgetting some of the bad parts. So we're forgetting our responsibilities as men. So again, we're forgetting some of the things that are sort of a burden that men should remember that they have. But we are also forgetting the nice parts. We're forgetting, sometimes, playing golf, playing poker, having a cocktail with your friends, dressing nicely. Not so shabby.
Now it's
so I think as you're
Oh no, I was just gonna say it's more like how to make a proper TikTok or something. That's what people are trying to,
right.
Trying to learn how to make a proper Instagram reel, or it's like getting so interesting.
We're trying to get Chris to teach me those things. Come on, Chris.
I'm still learning, man. I don't know how to do it. But no,
I teach. I just started teaching this year at a all boy high school. And it's interesting because I do I always compare it to you look at the sheetrock and it has like these holes in it, right? And there's mostly there, but there's just these gaps, right? And a lot of the gaps are things that are kind of these basic things, like I said, I'm a choir teacher, so like the guys having to know how to tie their ties for our performances. I mean, such a Bondian thing, right? Things that we would learn. And today we had a performance, and like probably a quarter of the guys, yeah, I don't know how to tie a tie. So we had a little master class, right? And in a way, that's being James Bond, right? But it's also kind of being
Matt Spacer,
a
plug your
man
ears now. Matt Spacer,
learning these things.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and it's interesting. I was teaching a confirmation class for young Catholic, boys and girls, 7th, 8th grade. So sort of the idea is that they're young adults now, and there was times that I would try to work in things that would fall under, again. I've said to the young men, I've said to them straight out, I said, fellas, listen, I know the messages are a little mixed, but the women that you're with are under your care. You are responsible for them. You're responsible for their safety. And a lot of them would kind of look at me funny. And I was like, yeah, I know. Like, I mean, again, things that would have been second nature, years ago, now sometimes not so much. Things like that. So I think it's very worthwhile to try to bring some of these attitudes to young men, especially, and let them know. Listen, you have again. I would say two things. You have responsibilities as men, and you also have things that are fun. There's fun parts about just being men. Just spending time with other men is always, I think, is necessary. Frankly, I think it's in some ways becoming a lost art in a lot of ways. Setting aside some time to again play a little poker, play a little golf, do something like that. All fun things. And again, when we look at all of the topics, all of the things that James Bond does, these are all pretty sweet. These a lot of really fun things. A lot of worse things you can do than go skiing or go scuba diving, or go to a casino, etc. So yeah, I would encourage young men to say, again, along with the responsibilities comes some nice things. So take advantage of both.
Yeah.
Well, so as we, part of our how-to Bond, we've always kind of connected a little bit to Bond 26, the future of Bond, where are we going? So I think my question for you from your book is, we've talked a lot about being James Bond, all these different things. My question, maybe semi-controversial, we'll see, is do you think Eon, the Bond producers, have the same view of what it means to be James Bond as you, other fans, whoever it might be? Or do you think there's some kind of something that might be different of what their view of Bond is now or could be in the future?
That's an interesting question. I mean, Lord knows I can't tell you what they're thinking, although I will say
another way to say it would be kind of, do you think how much do they recognize these characteristics that, like I said, that you're bringing up? And obviously some of them maybe more than others. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if they do. I think that, well, first off, it's funny because we're just coming off that, Barbara Broccoli was quoted as basically saying we're not doing anything yet. To which I was like, guys, I've been telling you this for a long time.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not a mind reader, but I can tell you straight out, they ain't doing much. They're all pretty exhausted, and no one's running out to do the next Bond. Again, which is sort of a shame, but again, I think that as soon as they do bring some fresh blood into the mix, that might change. I don't know if they do have a great understanding of the classic James Bond. And, it's funny because when Casino Royale came out, I thought the planets just aligned perfectly. And I thought, now there is that classic James Bond. I kind of felt that Craig's Bond in that film, clearly a man's man, clearly not afraid to speak his mind. He will tell you directly how he thinks and feels and not beat around the bush. And I think that's a pretty amazing trait when you think about it. I think it's a very underrated trait. Maybe underrated is not the word I'm looking for, but I don't know if people really appreciate just how important that is. In The Spy Who Loved Me, when Anya confronts James Bond with the photo of the boyfriend who he killed, even Roger Moore, who we sort of, look back as being, the softer James Bond, I suppose, the not so hard edge James Bond, he makes his point. He explained the situation, but at some point he says, "Yes, I killed him." He doesn't say, "Well, I mean, he says straight out, "Yes, I did." And he doesn't apologize for it. He says, "This is what had to happen, so this is what happened." And I think, when Bond is confronting Vesper after he loses the first time and he calls her an idiot to her face or whatever. And again, he didn't flinch. He said his piece. He didn't try to play nice and placate or whatever else. So anyway, I think that the current filmmakers now, I think they had it right in Casino Royale. So I don't know if they've lost it since. I think a lot of people, needless to say, a lot of people had mixed feelings about No Time to Die. I don't know if I think a lot of people were feeling that the writers were trying to sort of not let James Bond have his triumphant moment. I don't know if I completely agree with it. I sort of feel that for the most part, Craig's Bond in there is still pretty true to his character, I think. But again, I could be persuaded otherwise.
That's another episode.
Yeah, is right, isn't it though? I'll say this too. It's funny, Henry Cavill's name popped up again recently, which again sort of happens from time to time. There was some talk that maybe Christopher Nolan was coming in to do a series of period films. And a lot of the buzz that I was hearing was no, let's keep Bond in the modern days. And to me, I was thinking, I don't know. I kind of wouldn't mind seeing period Bond. And I think a lot of the reasons we're talking about is that I would love to see, if they did period films and you had Bond acting like classic Bond, I think you could, not that this would be my first priority, but that would be a great way to show young people, hey, look, this is how men used to act. This was pretty common, and they're putting kind of a modern shine on it so that, today's youth, today's viewers would embrace it a little bit more. It's hard to get young people to sit down and watch From Russia with Love or Goldfinger and not have them say, "Oh, this is so boring," because it's not. Okay, fair enough. I get it. I mean, it's a long time ago. Films were different. But if you did a period film today, I think you could probably capture some of that audience. And again, I think you could definitely show them, say, listen, this is how guys were. This is how it was back then, and it wasn't so bad. In fact, I live with my mother-in-law now. My wife's mother lives with us, so she sort of dominates the television a lot. So I see a lot of black and white films, and we were literally just watching something today from like 1945. And I swear to you, I look at some of those old movies, and again, I know I'm going to show my age. I know I'm the old man shouting at clouds, but I'm watching this and I'm saying, boy, what a different way to live. And if you compare that to today, woof, like what's wrong? Where did we get off track? So I think there's something to be said, for kind of shining a spotlight and sort of, showing people, look, there was a better way that we used to sort of do things.
Yeah, I mean, and being willing to put some of that, which may be at times like a little slower part of a film, especially into film, right? Like I think that's a piece. Like I feel like in the more current Bonds, a lot of these things are there, and especially some of the things like that you've talked about in your book, skiing, the more action oriented things. But sometimes kind of maybe the more deeper things, some of these things that you've talked about today, like about the kind of basic things of dress and food,
Manners.
drink,
Manners.
and those types of things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some ways I think those could come off as like we think that's too slow or it's going to slow down the movie or whatever it might be. And maybe one of the reasons, like you mentioned, Joe, about why, when some of those classic moments in Goldfinger or From Russia with Love or whatever that like are so impactful to a lot of us. But younger people are kind of, oh well, this is kind of slow or whatever it might be. And I think there's a place for that. And I think in the bonds going forth.
Yes, I completely agree, and I don't mean to cut you off before you ask your next question, but I think you're really hitting it on the head. Again, we watch a film like Casino Royale, and obviously the things that you remember most that sort of shine the brightest are, is Bond jumping from one scaffolding to the other. On the other hand, we still do pick up on a lot of the nuances. Bond sitting across from Vesper. This is one of the scenes that shine for a lot of people. Watching him stand up as she left the train car. Again, a lot of young guys probably not even realizing what just happened and why. But these are the things we pick up on, and I think they do shine in our minds a little bit.
Or even for me in Skyfall, the simple scene of him actually in Macau shaving, like the old-fashioned way, like things like that.
Right.
Well, and I'm a big
Yes.
believer that those are the things, some of the most lasting things from the Fleming Bond, right?
Yeah.
That, I'm kind of a believer, this is a future podcast episode, but about how the scripting of Bond over the years, and have they ever really got it right 100%? That's a question for another day. But I really do believe that one of the most enduring parts of Bond is these things that have all been talked about, that go back to the books, but then also in, scattered throughout the films, these things where it's just like, yes, that feels right. I hope going into the future, whatever the future will be, that these will still be included and we won't shy away from that, and whatever the next steps are.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I mean, and I think that's one thing that I really hope that we are at a funny crossroads where, it's not simply a matter of finding another James Bond actor and moving forward, because they've sort of, closed off the last chapter the way they did. They really do have to reinvent whatever the next film is going to be. They are genuinely starting from scratch. So it'll be interesting to see where they go. But I do hope that they remember, James Bond, the things that separate James Bond from every other action film star are all of the things that we're talking about. I mean, for me personally, I look at something like Honor Majesty's Secret Service, and I see the father trying to talk James Bond into dating the daughter. Like, you would never see that in a modern James Bond film, because we tend to, I think that people who are making the films today tend to focus on, well, it's, James Bond is a spy, so there has to be spy stuff, and he has to thwart the villain and all this good stuff. I get that. But again, it's all these other things that go along with it. You can't just have one token scene of him in a tux and call it a James Bond film.
Right.
You can't just have him say shaken, not stirred at least once in the movie. There you go. There's your No, you really have to flesh out some of these other things. I want to see James Bond ordering a local cocktail based on where he is in the world. I want to see him enjoying a location. I want to see him engaging in things that the upper crust would engage in, etc.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And so kind of as we wrap up here, one of the things that we've kind of tried to leave each of these how-to series with is we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about kind of the extremes, the bungee jumpings, the plane flying, all these things, to kind of more open things of like overcoming fears and things. What do you think is, a couple things that directly from reading your book, from being James Bond, are things that people could take, that you would hope people could take away to incorporate into their daily lives that you think would make the most impact for them, quote unquote, being James Bond, in their daily lives?
I hope that if they take anything away is a sense that the world is much bigger than just your little corner of it, and there's a lot out there. There's a lot of ways to tap into your inner James Bond. A lot of things we could do on a daily basis, whether it's simply how you take your coffee, to again rounding up a couple fellas for a couple holes of golf or a night of whiskey and poker kind of thing, to travel destinations. I mean, it's a big oyster out there. So and again, I hope that people will take away the sense that uh, the essence of James Bond has a lot to do with just the essence of being a man. Things that we didn't think we needed to even shout out and point to, but maybe we do, because maybe if we don't cultivate that amongst our younger generation, they will start to forget it. We do have responsibilities as men, and we should embrace those, and we should also embrace the nicer aspects of being a man. And yeah, I feel that there's never a shortage of something new that you can bring into your life. It would be nice if we all could say that we're just so complete and fulfilled that there's nothing else that we have left to learn. Well, there's always something to learn.
Mhm.
And I think whether it's a language, whether it's a new sport, whether it's a new travel location, something maybe you never would have given much thought before. Bond does introduce us to things, and it does give us a way to sort of think of things. I mean, had it not been for James Bond, I'm sure there's a lot of things that I would have done with my time on this earth, that would have been very satisfying and fulfilling. But thanks to James Bond, there were things that I would never have thought of, unless I saw him doing it first. So that brought things to me that I don't know how else I would have known to try these things. So yeah, that's what it's all about to me. And that's why James Bond to me is just it's a whole different animal to anything else in the world. It's incredibly unique, and we should really take advantage and kind of maximize the things that James Bond brings us.
As they say, never say no to adventure. That's
Mm-hmm.
one thing I've definitely learned from the whole Bond universe, if you will. For me personally, kind of, growing up with it and being inspired to push myself to not just learn one skill, but to learn multiple skills, because I think as an individual or as a man, it's important to go out into this world having a good sense of knowledge of everything, so you can be prepared for whatever this crazy world throws at you. And I think that's what Bond reflects too as a person, is he's so ready to adapt and learn even more skills. So that being said, leading to my final question, and then we'll let Joe off the hook, Joe. I promise. You can continue watching the film from 1940.
Until next time.
I'm always here, guys.
I have to ask. I know I told myself I would never ask. I'm not going to be that one guy that asked, but I got to ask, and I got to entice the listeners a little bit. What if there's any little hint or tease you can give us about possibly another being James Bond?
Great question. Well, I'll start out by saying this. My credibility when it comes to Volume 2 is pretty terrible, because I know for years I've been saying, "Oh yes, it's coming," and I know for years.
Just building suspense, Joe. Just building.
Yeah, and it's funny, and I've always been saying I'm real close to the end anyway. I put a lot of work into this, and it's pretty close to the end. And I was like, I'm just in the last dash, but the last dash sort of turns into like that hallway from Poltergeist that just kind of gets longer and longer and longer. But yeah, I actually have put a lot of work into it in the last year. I've kind of revisited this, and I do have solid plans to put it out in the next year. I was possibly even going to try to do it by the end of this year, but I feel like I want to sort of just cross a few more I's and dot a few more T's. So I would say probably in the spring. If I had to take a guess, I would say, that's when Volume 2 was going to come. And I think that, and again, since it's been so long, I'm definitely going to throw in a little extra goodies into it. So, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, there you
Okay,
go.
well, we might have to revisit a little bit once that comes out on have you back to do a little revisit for volume
Absolutely.
2.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joe, for coming on and continuing this series. I think there was just a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of great things in your book, but I think this conversation was really fun just to kind of go beyond just the basics that were all in your book, but to have some bigger conversations. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome, guys. This was I like that we kind of went down a lot of different roads too that I was not really planning for, but this was a lot of fun. So thank you. It's very good.
Hey, well, Chris, we have some exciting things coming up. We've got some podcasts. We're going to be doing probably one where you interview me and I interview you. So that's going to be exciting coming up. And then also maybe some kind of special holiday episode coming up. So we'll have to stay tuned for that.
Stay tuned. Yep.
Okay. Well, on behalf of myself, David Vanderbilt, and
Christopher Morales,
we'd like to thank you for watching Those Bond Guys podcast. We'll be back and have a great night.